Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome back to the Baltic Breakfast after a summer break. I'm sorry we're starting out with such a hot topic, but I'm glad to see so many here. So, the geopolitical context, I mean, there's nothing new for you. It's been hardened and harshened, and it's really occupying the news all over. So what's the role of science in all this? So today, we're going to discuss science diplomacy in times of crisis. We who organize these events are the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center, and my name is Gun Rudqvist, and normally I'm working with policy issues at the center. We are, of course, a research center, but we also have a mission to try to get research results closer and in dialogue with the rest of society. As always, there will be plenty of chances to ask questions and comment on the speakers. And if you're not here in the room, you can also ask questions either through email, but also on the Slido, and it's going to show the Slido code, and it's 22102. And if we don't have time to deal with all the questions, we'll collect them and get the comments from the researchers and then put them online. But as always, time is always running, so let's get started. We have today two excellent speakers with us, researchers. First out is Robert Blasiak. You are an associate professor at the Stockholm University Stockholm Resilience Center, where you focus on sustainable management of ocean resources and ocean stewardship. You have recently also worked a lot with issues surrounding the conservation and equitability of marine genetic resources. So you'll start first, and then we have Carina Barquet. Welcome. You are a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. You are also the team leader for Water, Coasts and Ocean Group, and you also lead the SIE Global Strategic Engagement for the Ocean. And your research, you work a lot with society's governance and management and risks across critical water infrastructures and functions, actually dealing with both offshore and coastal zones and urban areas. So warm welcome to you as well. But we'll get started. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gun. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you. And what a pleasure to start with a free breakfast. I mean, that's most days don't start that well. But I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Gun, for the invitation. And I'll get right into this because I'm really interested to hear some questions and have some discussion, too. So ocean peace. It's the question mark that you have to put in it, but can we make it a reality? And if you look at headlines, you start to see things like this. Whenever you look in the New York Times, if you look in Dagens Nyheter, things like this. Tragedy, conflict, tension in the ocean. More, you've seen probably all of these. And I could have 100 more of these. And this is kind of the reality you look at. It's the way the media is looking at the ocean today. But as a scientist, you look at that and your stomach kind of clenches and you think, but can it be different? Can my research make a difference? What is my role as a scientist in this space? Can I contribute to a more peaceful ocean? And the international community has also been taking note. So right now, we're at the halfway point of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. But before I talk about that, I always like to take a historical perspective because I feel like you can learn a lot from looking back in time. A lot of times, the kind of the speed of all the headlines, all the news, it can be a bit overwhelming. And you start to think, well, but is it all so new? Haven't we been here before? Some of this feels a bit cyclical sometimes. So this is one I always like to point out. There actually was a UN decade 50 years ago, the International Decade of Ocean Exploration. So I tried to learn about why that was motivated, where it came from. And back then, you find lots of old typewritten documents like this. I'm not going to read this to you, but this is from 1968, explaining the rationale for having a decade focused on the ocean. And here's 2 sentences from it. Increased use of the oceans and its resources may tend to exacerbate the already existing potential for conflict among maritime nations. And since these disputes may be due in part to inadequate scientific and engineering information, it's hoped that the decade programs will make an important contribution to the diminution of international tensions as they relate to ocean problems. This is from 1968, but let me show you what's happened since then. So this is a paper we published a few years ago called The Blue Acceleration, where we look at different trends of ocean use. And that was written in 1968. The starting point for all of these hockey stick curves is 1970, 2 years later. So at that time, they were already worried about conflict due to overlapping, increasing use of the ocean, but it was really kind of just starting at that time. So all of these concerns that existed then, they've become more present and more severe, I would argue. You see all of these increasing uses. So now if we turn back to the future, to the UN Ocean Decade, how does it deal with conflict and peace and the role of science in this space? So there's 7 intended outcomes. You see them all here. These are all excellent outcomes for a decade. Have a clean ocean, have a healthy ocean, have a productive ocean, and so forth. It's a dream scenario. It's a worthwhile thing to work towards. But if you look more closely at it, you also start to see some elements of environmental peace building throughout this agenda. A lot of it is focused on institution building, but what is this term, environmental peace building? Let me just get into that for a moment. So there are a number of different typologies for this, but let me give you one of the simplest ones. It just has 3 elements. So one of the elements of environmental peace building is referred to as the contact hypothesis, that by facilitating increased cooperation and creating dialogue across diverse groups, you can reduce bias and prejudice, bring people together, get them to know each other, understand that you're not that different after all. The second element is by introducing norms of environmental and governance and empowering civil society, so diffusing transnational norms across the world. The third is by effective state service provision, so providing access to public services that meet the needs of communities and increase their belief in the effectiveness of the public sector. So going back to the UN Ocean Decade, yes, there are structural elements, but nowhere in any of those documents from IOC UNESCO about the UN Ocean Decade are conflict or peace mentioned. And I look at this and I feel like it's a missed opportunity. So we wrote a paper about exactly this topic, and we propose developing an 8th outcome to the UN Ocean Decade, a peaceful ocean. Why not? It seems important as well. And we've been discussing this also with the leadership of IOC UNESCO to push this forward. And to provide ammunition for this, we look around the world and we find examples, and they seem to crop up more and more when you look around, even in areas of the ocean really characterized by intense conflict, tensions, risks. And this is something that I think it's very inspiring because, I mean, you won't be able to read all the little pieces of this, but each of these black dots is an example of an ocean science collaboration, cooperation in an area that's also characterized by different geopolitical tensions and where successful outcomes have been achieved. So I encourage you to look into this in more detail, and you'll also see HELCOM is one of the examples here, and I know Karina will be speaking more about that in a moment. We have a whole paper about it. Please challenge me on this or join me in lobbying for this. I think it's a very exciting space. But what next? I think there are several questions that I'm excited to look into. So one is, what is the future of science diplomacy and environmental peace building? Have we fully tapped its potential? Do we understand its potential? Can we do more to make it a tool for a more peaceful world? What are the factors that have actually contributed to these collaborations in the scientific space in conflict settings? How have they been able to extend even through some very tense times? And in others, why have they collapsed, or why have they stopped working? So what are those factors? What's the recipe? And finally, what does the reality of the modern world mean for all these things, these modern trends of blue acceleration, geopolitical tensions in the ocean space? What do they mean for ocean science collaborations into the future? We know it's an issue that's in our face. We know the ocean requires cooperation. How are we going to do that into the future? So I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Just a few follow-up questions before we give the floor to Carina. Well, I was thinking about then, you showed, of course, and stressed the structural elements of the environmental peace building thing. Would you say that these elements are well known and accepted? I mean, both sort of within the policy world, but also within science world?
No, and I think I kind of look inward at myself and at my colleagues, because I think we think of scientists in some sort of monolithic way, like each scientist is the same, kind of like corporations or politicians. They're all kind of the same thing. But of course they're not. There's incredible diversity, and there are a lot of scientists who are kind of like mushrooms. They like to work in dark places and write a paper and then send it out into the world, but don't really want to talk with anyone. And that there's absolutely a place and an importance for that type of science. And there are others who want to be on the streets marching and activists and pushing. And there's a place for that, I think, as well. And there's a whole spectrum of types of science. And I think that this type of typology, I don't think it's well known. And I think that there's a lot of collaboration that's happening where I think the scientists don't realize what an important role they're playing in this space. And this is a new way to look at it and value it.
But you would still argue that these types of structural elements, the 3 points you highlighted, they are workable, and would you say that one of them is more easy for us as scientists to push, or?
It's a good question.
Well, you can think about that, and we can get back to that in the discussion if you prefer.
Everyone has their favorite typology. I heard a quote somewhere that typologies or frameworks are like toothbrushes. Everyone has one, but no one wants to use anyone else's. So you kind of create your own. But I find them convincing and interesting. Okay. I think the contact hypothesis is maybe the most obvious starting place for scientists. But yeah.
But maybe finally, just you are part of the international discussion, and given the geopolitical change, do you sense a change in the general discussion around these issues?
Yes, but I get a little bit disheartened sometimes, because I feel like as scientists we also get really worn out, especially if you're interested in sustainability and stewardship and these big principles. The world is a reality kind of hitting you in the face each day. And I see people getting worn down. So I think we need new narratives that bring people, inspire people, empower people to understand the value that they have in moving towards a more positive outcome.
Okay. So let's put this on the agenda then even more. Yeah. Thank you so much, Robert, so far. So now, Carina Barquet, Stockholm Environment Institute, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Great. Thank you, Gun, for the invitation to be here. I'm a real fan of the Baltic Sea Breakfast. So I was thrilled when I got your email. And thank you as well, Robert, for a great presentation and segue. Let's see if I get this. So I would like to start my presentation with a concrete example of some of the issues that Robert touched upon, environmental peacemaking, science diplomacy. And I'm very sure many of you are well aware and perhaps are even experts yourselves about HELCOM, so I'm not going to go into in a lot of depth when it comes to the HELCOM, but I would like to bring up a few issues that are, a few facts that are actually important for the discussion in my coming slides. Starting with the date when HELCOM was signed, prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and agreed upon by the then 7 Baltic coastal states. To address the growing threats to the marine environment due to industrial activity. And it's good to know that it was the first of its kind, as it involved all incumbent parties over a shared basin, and it addressed all sources of pollution. And for decades, HELCOM functioned as a rare East-West dialogue. It was a platform that superseded the tensions at the time, until the Soviet Union dissolved, and then the new independent states formed and then joined the convention. And it is also interesting to highlight that the convention is an international agreement, but with vague provisions. So, for example, the Baltic Sea Action Plan, which serves as a main instrument for operationalizing the convention, has an unclear status. And despite this unclear status, HELCOM has managed to succeed in some very important areas, for example, the significant reduction of discharges of organic pollutants, but also other areas like cooperation on issues like shipping safety. And so HELCOM, together with the current geopolitical landscapes, is what sets the scene for the process that the European Commission got going last year, actually 2 years ago now, to formally explore the role that science diplomacy could or should have in the EU foreign policy. The following slides are a bit of a summary of the report that was launched last year by the Commission, which summarized the recommendations of about 130 diplomats and scientists from all over the EU, including myself. And it was directed to the European External Action Service and the Commission. And you're going to have to bear with me. I'm bringing a new toothbrush as well. But it is a common question: what do we mean by science diplomacy? And there is a typology here, which it is actually interesting. So I'm actually going to walk you through it, and you feel free to go into the report to dig for more details. If we start in the upper left corner, science in diplomacy, then it is about informing foreign and security objectives with scientific advice. And this is a realization that many of the issues that are being negotiated actually require quite high level of scientific knowledge. Examples of this type of science diplomacy we find in the IPCC, nuclear arms control, and all other non-proliferation agreements like the Antarctic Treaty, or international economic systems like the Bretton Woods system. If we move over to the upper right corner, diplomacy for science, then it is about facilitating international science cooperation by diplomatic action. And examples of this you find in international agreements such as the decision by the US and Russia in '93 to build an international space station, or in 2017, the establishment of the Arctic Council Agreement for Scientific Cooperation. If we move to the bottom right corner, science for diplomacy, then this is about using science cooperation to improve relations between countries. Quite similar to what Robert was speaking about. Here it includes a lot of bottom-up processes, starting through personal scientific networks, building trust, even when states might refuse to speak to each other. It could also be about sharing international research infrastructures. And an example of this is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, which combines a pretty big group of countries, even when they have been traditionally at odds. And if we finally move over to the bottom left corner, diplomacy in science, then it refers to the use of the diplomatic skills and tools in and by science, and includes scientific institutions being basically diplomatic players in their own right. Now, this might be the most polemic type of science diplomacy, because science then starts acting as some sort of global voice, a little bit like what the International Science Council has become sometimes when speaking with organizations like the UN, or when research organizations and research funders cut ties with partners in other countries for political reasons. Good to know is that the report is not advocating for one or the other. It's simply trying to capture what's going on already and come up with a typology to understand and be able to explain what science diplomacy is about. And also worthily to note that science diplomacy doesn't mean the same thing as international scientific cooperation, and it doesn't mean either, it's not the same thing as blue or green or digital diplomacy. There are many concepts out there. The difference here is that there's a conscious aim to integrate it to foreign policy aims. Another thing that's also useful to recognize is that there are sort of different schools of thought influencing the type of science diplomacy that we engage with. And these range from a cooperation-oriented view, which sees science diplomacy as serving the public good, tackling global challenges, and essentially doing things for the benefit of humankind. And this view essentially suggests that scientists all over the world speak the same language. We abide by similar scientific practices and are therefore well placed to foster some sort of peaceful cooperation from the bottom. If we go to look at the competition-oriented realpolitik, it's phrased as in the report, it's a perspective that regards science as the use of science for foreign policy purposes. And here science is emphasized as an instrument for state interests, and it could be strategic autonomy, it could be technological sovereignty, or it could be even economic competitiveness. And two examples here include the decision by the EU to cut scientific relations with Russia following the invasion in 2022, or limiting the access to China to cutting-edge Western technologies. And here diplomacy speaks a completely different language. It's a language of power, and it may seek to use the results of science for other purposes that go beyond science. And so this view is quite at odds with the cooperative view. We outline in the report two paradigm shifts that have caused a shift in what we think has been a decade dominated by the cooperation-oriented science diplomacy, moving over to a more competitive oriented view. And Robert, you mentioned several things already regarding the recent geopolitical incidents affecting particularly the marine space. And as a result of these incidents, there's an increased push to for us researchers to abide to safety and security guidelines that might cut off what we feel as academic freedom. And so we can't change the geopolitical landscape, but we can choose how to act. And here the role of science diplomacy is to make sure there's still some degree of openness to convey and engage despite insecurities. And on the other hand, we also have a changing scientific and technical landscape where developments have changed the way that science interacts with society. And today, for many of us, the quadruple helix is now common wisdom. Funders increasingly encourage, but actually demand us to engage with a very wide range of actors. And the pressure is high for us to contribute to things like competitiveness or bringing innovation closer to markets. And this also applies to research that might have military means, not the least in the marine space. And as a result, the academic freedom, we realize that there's new responsibilities coming with what we can do. And we might not always be aware or comfortable with this. I won't go into depth into this, but I want to mention that the report does conclude with some recommendations that are grouped into three types. Strategic instruments that aim to give some sort of overall direction for how science diplomacy can be done in the EU. We provide also operational instruments, which means how science diplomacy can be actually put into practice. And then the enabling instruments to set some sort of foundations and shared values for how we will understand and relate to the concept. And what I can say is that the global commons was identified as the most suitable and urgent science diplomacy issue. And here global commons, it goes beyond the 4 or 5 classical categories that we know, like the space, the poles, climate, the ocean, to also include things like AI, health, or even the water cycle. And well, the discussions in the groups were of course broader and less consensual than the report and my presentation might suggest, but we do have to come to some sort of conclusion, and our conclusion was that there is indeed a need and a desire for some form of science diplomacy, but our strong recommendation to the Commission is to dig deeper into many of the questions that are still unsolved, and before setting up the bricks of what science diplomacy should look like. I don't go into all the discussions, but I do want to highlight 2 of the questions that my group was strongly advocating, and I think we got it into the report. The first is to understand the conditions in which science can actually influence policy, and the second is to look into what we have done. And Robert, again, you brought up several examples. We think there has been work done that is worth looking at to understand what made it, how did they succeed or failed, so that we don't end up committing the same mistakes that we did in the past. Just before I conclude, I want to go back to the example of HELCOM. There's a lot of research out there that has highlighted some of the sort of structural things and contextual things that have made HELCOM succeed. And by succeed, I don't mean that the Baltic Sea is in a good state, but the fact that collaboration has gone on despite all the geopolitical and regional changes. And I just want to mention a few of them. The first is that there was previous scientific and technological cooperation between the neighboring countries. So HELCOM didn't start on a void. It started on something already. There was momentum post-1990. There was optimism, and the newly built states were eager to show their sovereignty, but also connect closer to the neighboring countries. HELCOM had legitimacy because it was perceived to sort of float above water between on the east and west clash. And so that sort of proved that environmental cooperation could persist, and geopolitical fragmentation among states would not necessarily influence to that extent those relationships. HELCOM also had a pretty specific scope, even though it touched upon all areas of pollution in the Baltic Sea. It is an environmental convention. And environment, at least up until recently, has traditionally been considered a sort of easier, non-political scientific field of cooperation. There were other issues, like Russia was interested in some of the issues that HELCOM was addressing. And importantly, HELCOM has been able to adapt and evolve based on the regional changes. So the HELCOM from the 1970s is not the HELCOM from today. However, this same research also highlights and warns that the preconditions for this positive interdependence that we've seen in the past is currently missing in the Baltic Sea region. And I want to conclude, not with conclusions. I want to end my presentation not with conclusions, but with a question, because this brings up a lot of doubts regarding how the future of marine cooperation will look like and the role of science diplomacy. Will marine regional cooperation sustain science diplomacy, and what is the role of science diplomacy in sustaining marine regional cooperation as our seas are growing busier, riskier, and more sensitive? And with that, I end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karina. I'll just start by asking what I asked Robert. This concept, would you sense that there's a growing understanding and acceptance and interest among your fellow scientists? I mean, not the group who was in the work, for sure, but...
Acceptance is an interesting one. There was a lot of pushback, even amongst the group that was involved in bringing the recommendations. There is no agreement on whether this is really the scientist's role to get into diplomacy, and what would that mean for scientists' freedom. What would we need to be doing in order to be acting as diplomats? And on the other hand, there's those that think that we can't be so naive. We cannot be left untouched from what's happening in the world. We need to act accordingly and be conscious about the safety and other geopolitical concerns. So there is no consensus there.
Okay, so you touched upon the different aspects of the report and how the EU as an institute, as a body, could move forward. Would that you just mentioned be one of the more difficult bottlenecks, the lack of acceptance? Because I suppose that's even wider within if you go outside the group.
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess if the EU would decide to go for one or the other, then there would be a lot of pushback. But if they're now they accepted this sort of taxonomy, and if it is up to everybody to decide for what type of science diplomacy you want to live up to, there would be less resistance. I'd say there will be a lot of questions once you start thinking about how this will be rolled out. So things like there was a lot of discussion about how will we relate to other parts of the world, for example. A lot of groups, including my own, thought that it was absolutely important to meet other regions, Asia, Latin America, Africa, halfways, whereas others thought that it was important to enforce EU values on others. And there was no consensus there either. And then a second thing was how will this be done, for example? Will it be based on a GDP per country basis? Will the poorer countries in the EU be forced to pay the same thing as... So the House will be, as usual, the issue that creates most debate.
Please, Robert, join us and we'll continue the discussion. I'll just put this out so you don't get that.
We're very color coordinated,
Yeah,
I
please.
realize. Maybe we
Good job.
Let me start by sort of picking up where you ended, Carina, saying that how do we then move from this as a discussion and a structural element and sort of more a theoretical approach to where you are going? I mean, having the hands-on experiments. I mean, what would be steps for society? Oh, that's a tricky one. Please, if you have thoughts in general, yeah.
Well, I was talking with some colleagues yesterday, and we were talking about parachute science, which is one of the horrible things to think about these days. That scientists will go into some remote part of the world, collect all this stuff, go back home, publish it, and not like parachute in. But I think there's another thing. I'd like to introduce the term telescope science, where you just kind of look over there. What are those people doing? Okay, I'll publish about that. And not get involved. And I think that that's maybe the natural tendency of scientists, is not to get involved, to try to be a fly on the wall. But I think we've got to get out of that. And I think that that takes support from your institutions when you kind of step in it, when you don't make the right decisions. But also it's a learning space, and it's miles outside of the comfort zone for most scientists. But I think we need to get more into that. Get involved.
Yeah. Carina.
And I'd say we'll figure it out as we move along. I think one starting point was already taken by Stint, who was also actually a member of this expert group. And I'm sure you've seen the concept of responsible internationalization around, which is essentially how to do science responsibly. I think the degrees of awareness of our scientists differ quite a lot depending on your institution, your experience, etc. And so perhaps it's about bringing it to a level which is more even, that allows us to still be open with our science, but be careful about how we do it. So I don't want to be too prescriptive, because I might get a lot of questions.
So in times of crisis, is there always sort of a role for science to keep on cooperating? Or are there situations where one has to say, no, this is enough, we cannot work together?
The first one, yes.
First one,
There's
okay.
always a role, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that some of the research that has done shows exactly what Robert is saying. There is always a role, and again, going back to the example of HELCOM, it might be very thin lines that hold some level of cooperation together, but those are the thin lines that you can go back to once things stabilize. But if you don't have those, it's I don't know how you do it. It's an uphill, basically.
Okay. But I mean, how can you stay objective? But maybe science is never objective, I suppose, or? That's a tricky one. Sorry, I'm posing all these tricky ones today. Yeah.
There's bias in everything we do, right? From the type of questions that we choose to engage with to how we see the world. So there's never pure objectivity. And that's, I think, as a researcher, that's the first thing to learn, to accept that there is some level of subjectivity. Then, of course, the methods force you to try to be as objective in how you do it. But, of course, we're biased by gender, age, experiences, a lot of parameters, basically.
You would agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going through a period now in science where there's a lot of reflexivity is encouraged. And as Carina was saying, reflecting on your privilege, your gender, your background. But I think that hasn't gotten so much into your role. Are you a policy, are you an influencer of policy, a diplomat, a communicator, an activist? What are you, as a scientist? Are you just a scientist? And I think we haven't gotten into that space as rigorously as we have with others.
Sounds like we have to have a Baltic breakfast on the role of science. Okay. Now, please, join us for questions, thoughts. Where are you starting? Michaela, my colleague here, is running around. Yeah. And please introduce yourselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Lisset. I've been in diplomacy for 35 years, including environmental diplomacy. And I've really seen the role of science in shaping the Paris Agreement, for instance, and the scientific and practical cooperation between the US and China was instrumental. It was one of the real pillars in reaching the Paris Agreement. And also, I think, I'm here also with Matthias Wust, who's been working on ocean affairs for how many years? Many. You were also working with shaping the BB&J agreement, I think, or on in the margins.
Yeah,
And
okay.
also HELCOM.
Yeah, we'll
And-
give you
and-
the mic later, Matthias.
Yeah, other issues. But I have a question. How do you see the challenge we're facing currently with the president of the most influential, or one of the most influential countries of the world, not believing in science and maybe not believing in diplomacy either?
Let me introduce myself. My name is Robert. I'm from the United States. I'm also Swedish now, officially, but yeah, you know how to hit me where it hurts. And that's, I think, if you look at the latest elections in the US, from outside of the US, there's always a feeling that we're kind of almost bipolar, that everyone's inspired by Obama. We're all going in this direction, the long trajectory of justice. And then we just forget all that and go into this dark ages. But it's always basically half of the country that's on either side. And that's the weird thing about it. So the half of the country that's the rest of the world embraced during the Obama administration, it's still there. And it also needs something to eat and be inspired by now. And I think that even more so. So yes, there's not leadership from the top, but there can be leadership everywhere else, and it's even more important now.
So what you're saying is really keep going.
Keep going, yes, yes.
Carina.
And I'd say, I mean, it's easy to look at the US and others and sort of put the blame on the evil guys, but I think we should look inwards as well, because I guess in this case, the US selected their president, and I guess they can stand for whatever he does, but we didn't. And we are following that path as well. And that's what surprises me. We still have a choice to some extent. As a diplomat, probably it's arguable whether you really indeed have a choice or whether you just need to follow the established path lines. But why are we following on those steps? We didn't vote for that. And yet Sweden is following. A lot of companies are now removing from their branding everything related to sustainability and climate, even though we didn't vote for it. So I think my question is, what are we doing here to stop that, or to resist that, or to try to find ways around it?
Good point. We have one more question, I think. Somebody, Henrik? Oh, similar question. Oh, somebody's down there. Claire, I thought. Similar questions. Anybody else? And what about... Oh, here is Matthias, of course.
Well, I've already been introduced, right? Matthias Rust. I'm also working at the government offices, and I've been working a lot with HELCOM, inside HELCOM. So it was a very good example. But HELCOM is a very distinct example. It's a fixed location. It was a very specific situation, and it's been working very well, just like you said. But in all cases, you can always wonder, how much do science influence decision making? And when I was young, I thought it was, a lot, close to 100%. But I realized, no. I mean, science has a role. In some places, it's a huge role. In some places, lesser, depending on the situation. So in the Baltic Sea, there's a lot of science topics, but there's a lot of political topics where science perhaps has lesser role. But it did good. So my question, listening to all your very interesting thoughts, that I could certainly, drink a couple of beers and discuss for a long time with you. But if you look at the world right now, Trump is an example, but there's tons of others. Where do you see, when it comes to topics or spatial area, where science diplomacy has the highest potential to do good?
That's good. We're looking for hope, yeah?
I mean, maybe sort of falling back into the example of HELCOM and the context in which it took place, but also research, own research, others' research. Environmental issues were seen as non-political, and it was part of the reason why HELCOM succeeded. But if we are in a context where the environments where these collaborations are taking place are seen as political, then it will naturally be much difficult to get that collaboration going. Based on that, I would guess that sort of the low-hanging fruits would be areas that are not seen as political, and let that grow sort of bottom up, as we were discussing.
What could that be? Environmental toxins? I don't know. I'm just guessing something. What could that be then? That's not so Ooh, tense.
I'm hoping for PFAS. That's not, but I
PFAS
don't know.
maybe, yeah, okay. Yeah, well that's...
Maybe the defense might not be happy about it, but I'm hoping for things where you can't really put the blame on anyone.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Robert?
So I'm an ocean person, so I feel like it's almost heresy to not talk about an ocean topic, but I'm going to commit this heresy and say birds. Because this seems like no matter where you go in the world, there are communities of people who just love birds, and that it connects people in a way that's amazing. And birds connect nations in a way that's amazing, because they're these big migratory corridors that reach basically across the poles in different parts of the world. And in order for these species to continue to exist, they need to have basically stopover points or nesting sites along these pathways. And if you lose a couple of the countries from your pathway, then you've lost your species. And this is a topic I was really inspired to read. North Korea, which maybe you think has no connection to anything or anyone, very much does. And they're a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity. They've sent in their biodiversity strategy and action plans. And it's all about birds and flyways. And they're a member of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. And they have nesting sites for storks, and they share information about it. And these are ones that go to Japan and South Korea and everywhere else. So why not birds? Sure.
Okay,
but can I really quickly do an ocean one too?
Of
Okay,
course.
the other one, just in the Caspian Sea, it's a landlocked sea, but there's a single species of seal in the Caspian Sea seal. And endangered and located in a part of the world that for decades, all the countries around it were basically at war. And the only thing they could agree on, that they didn't even have diplomatic relations, but the only thing they could agree on was, let's try to save this seal.
Okay.
So there's been a program for decades to work on that.
Good
So
example, yeah.
There's the ocean.
Lisa, I know we have a question from...
Yeah, we have a question from the internet. What role do you think indigenous people's knowledge can play in fostering or developing science diplomacy?
I did research a while ago in Central America, and there it was communities that was basically a mix of everything, including indigenous populations. And a lot of the collaboration started with the ecosystems and the traditions that the indigenous populations were upholding. So I mean, naturally, in most areas that are populated and the population is indigenous, and they will have an important role to play. I might say something that's going to be very politically incorrect, but I can put it back into research, and that's, I don't think there's any group that's totally good or totally totally evil or totally bad. It's everybody has a role in each context, and in the context that I researched, they were the biggest hinder for collaboration. So I don't want to say that a specific group is better than the other. Of course, the people that are living in an ecosystem are important. Of course, indigenous peoples might have a lot of experience in the past, but they could also have a very opposing role in whatever negotiations are being conducted. So, like any group, it has to be integrated and handled carefully.
Okay, so again, site-specific, yeah.
Yeah, I would point at the BBNJ negotiations, actually, because...
you have to explain that, the BBNJ.
So it's an acronym. So the BBNJ, Biodiversity in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. Areas beyond national jurisdiction, it's the ocean that if you measure out about 200 nautical miles from the coastline, it's about 370 kilometers. Beyond that is areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's almost half of the Earth's surface. And there have been negotiations in various forms for about 20 years on how to manage biodiversity in various ways in this area, the BBNJ negotiations. And yesterday, the 54th state ratified the BBNJ agreement. It's been adopted. When 60 states ratify it, it enters into force. Which
and we're waiting for Sweden, right?
Sweden probably sometime next year. And yeah, hopefully enters into force within the next few months, by the start of next year. But anyway, sorry, just to, I showed you these hockey stick curves, all the economic interest in the ocean. That convinces a lot of people in the room we should talk about this. But I always found that the representatives from indigenous communities, they elevated the discussion in a way that was interesting because they weren't focused on those hockey stick curves. For them, the connection with areas beyond national jurisdiction was something more profound and fundamental. And that always kind of pulled people out of the details.
Okay.
I think, but maybe I'm wrong. I can be told later, but yeah, I think they were a positive voice there.
Thank you. We have time for one more last question.
Hi, John Simon with Total Impact Capital and former American diplomat. There's one place, it seems, where science, diplomacy, and oceans are coming together with a great deal of urgency, and that's with the melting of the polar ice caps, the Arctic Sea. And I just would wonder how you rate the efforts in science and diplomacy to address the issues there.
I almost want to just turn this back on you and ask your rating. I'd be curious to hear. I just don't know enough to be able to say something reasonable here. I mean, I've read some of the same headlines. It doesn't look like it's going well at the moment, but maybe I'm just misreading it. But I'd be interested to hear from others.
I wish they would sustain the collaboration. In fact, scientists are screaming about the problems that stopping the data collection will cause. Decades of data collection are now being hindered by governments. And when you hear scientists talk about, like the Polar Secretariat and the people around it talk about it, they're not losing data, they're losing friends, and they're losing like family and people that they've known for 25 years. And this is the thin threads that I'm talking about, that we should hold on to them. And I understand if data collection and sharing is not possible to the same extent, but I hope that some ways around it can be found to sustain that.
Thank you. Good way of ending for a hopeful way. Thank you so much. Wasn't this an excellent way to start the Baltic Sea Day? Are you aware that it's the Baltic Sea Day today? Over 100 activities around the Baltic Sea is happening, either today or through this week, to put the Baltic Sea on the agenda. So thank you so much for coming. The next Baltic Breakfast will be on 24th of September, and we're going to talk about fish. Welcome back.
Thank you.